The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all. I am Ridil Mishra and on behalf of K Ratings welcome you to our industry webinar series. Today we'll be talking on aluminium sector, impact on Indian aluminium industry due to imposition of tariffs by the United States. We appreciate your time in joining us for this webinar. To take you further on this, may I introduce our speakers for today. We have with us Mr. Sanjay Agarwal. Mr. Agarwal is a senior director at K Ratings and has over 23 years of experience in the field of ratings, banking, and infra finance. He is a grad CWA and fellow membership of ICAI. He is also qualified as financial risk manager from GAP USA and as certified financial planner from FPSB India. Our second speaker for today is Mrs. Urvisha Jagasheth. Urvisha is working as a research analyst and is part of the industry research team at K Ratings. I would like to inform, as always, our discussion is in the form of a presentation which is visible on your screen. In case of queries, please key in your query in the questions in the slot provided. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. May I request Mr. Sanjay to begin the session?
Thank you, Mridul, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. We welcome you all in today's webinar, which is based on the Indian aluminium industry. Aluminium is one of the lightest metals in the world, and as a result, it is widely used in production of multiple products. On 1st of March 2018, the US government made an announcement of imposing tariff on imported steel and aluminium, a measure aimed at reviving and boosting the domestic metals industry in US, and on 8th of March made it official. This resulted in US imposing tariff of 25% on foreign-made steel and a 10% tariff on imported aluminum, excluding a couple of countries. Now, India is among the lowest cost producers of aluminum across the world, owing to easy availability of raw materials and comparatively lower labor costs. The growing demand for aluminum in the last decade, driven by India's underlying growth story, has resulted into expansion of smelting capacities of the major domestic players. Even though India accounts for only 2% of the aluminum imported to the US, there already exists an oversupply in domestic market despite a recovery in demand over the previous year. Before we move on to this issue, before we discuss more on this issue, I would like Urvisha to take over the presentation and highlight upon domestic aluminum industry, its value chain, movement in global prices, financial standing of the aluminum industry, and give an introduction of the aluminum industry in the US and also our view on the industry. Over to you, Urvisha.
Thank you, Sanjay sir. So, in the start, we are going to discuss upon the overview of the aluminium industry and the standing which India has in the aluminium industry as a whole. So, the aluminium production process is divided into the upstream and downstream activities. The upstream process involves mining and refining activities, while downstream process involves smelting, casting, and fabricating. Aluminium downstream fabricated products include rods, sheets, extrusions, and foils. Now, globally, aluminium is produced in two different methods. One is the primary production process. Now, that involves the conversion of the ores to aluminium, and the other is secondary production, which is the recycling of the aluminium scrap. And since aluminium is 100% recycled, so the entire scrap is used as a whole again and can be used for production and consumption. In India, primarily, aluminium industry is dominated by three companies, that is Hindalco and Vedanta, which are privately owned, and Nalco, which is a public sector undertaking having a Navratna status. The aluminium production first begins with the mining of bauxite and ends with liquid aluminium getting converted into various products. The aluminium production process can be broken down into three stages. First, mining of the bauxites, which contain the aluminium ore, which are extracted from the ground. Second, the bauxites are processed into alumina or aluminium oxide. And finally, pure aluminium is produced. Now, bauxites consist of approximately 45 to 60% of the aluminium oxide, along with various impurities such as sand, iron, and other metals. Approximately, it takes 3 to 4 kgs of bauxite to produce 1 kg of alumina, and it takes again 2 kgs of alumina to produce 1 kg of aluminium. The process of bauxite refining involves the use of Bayer process, and once the bauxite is converted to alumina, further on the process is then called a reduction of the alumina to aluminium, and that process is called the Hall-Héroult process, which is extremely intensive of electricity usage. Now, in India, the production of bauxite has grown at a healthy rate of 10.5% compounded annual growth rate during FY13 to FY17. India has bountiful of bauxite reserves and mining potential, and there has been a constant rise in the production and mining of bauxite. With bauxite being mining robustly, the apparent consumption has also grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 18.4% during the same period. Till financial year 15-16, India was consuming around 75 to 80% of the bauxites produced, while the rest of the commodity was being exported. Now, due to the rise in the demand of aluminium in the domestic markets, there has been a sudden drop in the exports in financial year 16-17. India exports bauxites to China, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, France, Japan, Slovenia, USA, UK, Oman, Italy, and Kuwait. China is the main importer of bauxites from India, which is almost about 90% of the total bauxite exports. Imports are quite negligible in comparison to the exports, but whatever little India does import, it's from Guinea and from Brazil. So the second stage, which is the alumina, once the bauxite passes through the Bayer process of manufacturing, the finished product is alumina. Alumina is processed in the refinery plants. Now, smelter grade alumina accounts for almost 90% of the alumina which is produced, and it is then further transported to aluminium plants where it is electrolyzed into the aluminium metal. The current capacity of alumina smelters in India is about 6.97 million tons. Refineries are now supplied power from these captive power plants. The regional trend of capacities clearly indicate that the new capacities for alumina refining have emerged in the close vicinity of bauxite reserves as against the close proximity for cheap power. Each player is trying to backward integrate himself by focusing on securing its raw material requirements, as the bauxite cost is one of the key elements in determining the cost of production. The acquisition of mines or mining rights has gained importance, and the companies who have achieved to do so are able to produce low-cost alumina. Domestic alumina production has increased at a 13.7% CAGR during financial year 13 to financial year 17. Most of the alumina produced is used for domestic consumption, that is by the respective companies to manufacture the aluminium metal. Surplus alumina is exported. Consumption of alumina, on the other hand, has grown at a 11.6% CAGR during the same period. An increase in the consumption of alumina is reflected in the increase in the production of aluminium. Primarily, India is a net exporter of alumina, as most of the companies in the aluminium sector are backward integrated. That means these companies have the ownership of these mines to its full extent on ore requirement. Those players who have access to bauxite mines further process the ore to alumina and export a certain amount of alumina which is left out after captive consumption. Other players who do not have the access to bauxite mines either import the ore or alumina to feed their refinery smelters. With the growth in consumption of aluminium, there's also been a rise in the imports of alumina. The end product now, once the alumina is passed through the Hall-Héroult process, is the aluminium. Now, primary aluminium, which is initially in liquid form, is casted into extrusion ingots, sheet ingots, or foundry alloys, all depending on what it is used for. Currently, for production, we have the primary aluminium data. So now primary aluminium has grown at a production rate of CAGR 13% during financial year 13 to financial year 17. Production of aluminium needs abundant amount of power. Domestic players rely on coal-fired captive plants for power and fuel requirements. Now, power accounts for approximately 30% of the total cost of production for aluminium. Indian manufacturers have an advantage of abundant source of bauxite, access to cheap labor, and access to captive power plants, which has aided in increasing the efficiency of production. Consumption of aluminium, on the other hand, has grown at a CAGR of approximately 3% during the same time frame. Aluminium is 3 times lighter than iron, but it is as strong as steel, extremely flexible, and corrosion resistant due to the thin layer of aluminum oxide. Aluminum has been continuously finding new applications due to rising price competence, superior weight to strength ratio, corrosion resistance, formidability, and dampness. On the industrial side, aluminum is mainly used in electrical power transmission, machinery and equipment, and for construction activities. For housing, as aluminum is a lightweight material, it is a good substitute for steel in wood doors and windows and slidings. On the consumer side, aluminum is used in a variety of retail products, including cans, packaging, air conditioners, furnitures, and vehicles. Now, the surplus stock, of primary aluminium, is exported mainly to South Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Italy, Turkey, USA, Taiwan, Spain, Japan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Singapore, Brazil, and the Netherlands. In FY17, South Korea has accounted for approximately 38% of the overall aluminium exports, followed by Malaysia at 14% of the exports. India has approximately 4 million tons of aluminium capacity. Now, in the current financial year, we have been seeing quite a mixed picture. There has been a fall in the bauxite mining due to the dilemmas over the bauxite duties, and that has shrunk the bauxite mining operations. Alumina production, on the other hand, has remained subdued on the account of lower bauxite dispatches. But all of this has not affected the production of the primary aluminium, as primary aluminium has increased on operational efficiencies due to the better capacity utilization. This slide, we will be talking about the global aluminium prices. Since the international aluminium prices in the last 1 year has seen a 23.6% rise amid the fluctuations. Prices were $1,791 per ton in January 2017, and it rose to $2,215 ton in January 2018. A rise in prices can be attributed to supply cuts undertaken by the Chinese government in order to reduce overcapacity and to address environmental issues. The Chinese government's efforts are expected to translate into the closure of approximately around 4 million tons of the country's capacity. So that is approximately accounting to 10% of the country's total smelting capacity. Since China is one of the most major consumer and producer of the metal, the economic conditions of the nation, the smelter capacity, production projections, and any ramp up or shutdown of plants has a direct bearing on aluminium prices. Now, LME also, which is the London's metal exchange, daily publishes inventory levels of aluminium, which has a direct impact on the prices of aluminium and on the stock prices of the aluminium producing companies. If you notice, the prices of aluminium had taken quite a dip in financial year 16. So the key reason was because the Chinese economy had experienced a slowdown due to the change from an investment-driven economy to a consumer-driven economy. And the oversupply of Chinese aluminium due to overcapacity had caused the prices to fall sharply in FY16. We're now talking about the segment margins of the aluminium industry. So, to understand the financial performance of the aluminium industry, we have analyzed the sales growth and the operating margins of the three major players which dominate the Indian aluminium market. For this, we have considered the segmented sales and operating profits of Vedanta and Hindalco, the aluminium division, and the standalone financial statements for National Aluminium Company. The sales realization and operating profit margins of the domestic aluminium players largely depends on the aluminium prices globally and in the domestic markets. Global commodity prices were extremely volatile during financial year 15 onwards due to the slowdown in the Chinese economy, which in turn affected the domestic players for aluminium, which had a direct bearing on the sales growth and operating profit margins of the domestic aluminium players. Higher price of the metal coupled with an increase in volumes due to the ramp up of domestic capacities in the financial year 15 has led to a higher growth in sales and increased operating profit margins. During financial year 17, we can observe there has been a recovery in the prices of aluminium, which has also reflected in an improved operating profit margin and sales growth. Okay, so now we will be discussing about the US tariff. As mentioned earlier, the imposition of the import tariffs on the aluminium is aimed at protecting the internal economy of the United States, which has been affected by cheap imports. USA plans to ramp up the metals production capacity, curb imports, revive the industry, and also provide employment to the US citizens. From 2013 to 16, aluminium industry's employment in USA has fallen by 58% as 6 smelters shut down. Currently, only 2 of the remaining 5 smelters are operating at capacity, even though demand has grown considerably. Now, the reasons for the shutdown of these aluminium smelters were due to the financial distress faced by the producers due to lower metal prices, increased Chinese competition, and high energy cost. Nearly 90% of the aluminium demand in the USA is met through imports, and imports have risen from 3.5 million tons to 5.0 million tons during 2011 and 17. The increased imports, coupled with a decline in global aluminium prices, had led to the decline in capacity utilization of these aluminium manufacturers from 69% in 2013-16 to 39% in 2017. Now, as per the Department of Commerce estimation, again, the tariff hike is intended to lead to a doubling of the capacity utilization rate. So they aim to double it at 80%. And with these doubling of the capacity utilization rate, they would like to restrict imports to 4.3 million tons, which is approximately 13% lower than what it was in 2017. US domestic production could rise to 1.4 million tons, which is again 85% increase from the current levels. The increased production would cater to approximately 20% of US domestic demand. This is again assuming if the demand and the export levels of calendar year 17 are maintained. The two neighboring countries, Canada and Mexico, have been exempted from the tariff hike. Canada has always been the largest contributor to the overall aluminium exports of the US, accounting for a 43% share, followed by Russia and UAE, which have an 11% and 10% share respectively. While imposing a tariff on aluminium and on steel, USA had also declared that it may soften its stance towards other countries based on their bilateral relations and negotiations. The impact this tariff could have on India. So now in financial year 17, the primary aluminium exports to the US by India was approximately 49.1 thousand tons, which is accounting for only 2.1% of the 2,342,000 tons of primary aluminium exported by India. Both in quantity and value terms, the aluminium exports from India towards USA has accounted for approximately only 1 to 3% of the total exports. Okay, so now during the current financial year, that is till the period of April to December, primary aluminium exports to the USA has grown by approximately 4.6%, and it has become again 4.6% in value wise itself. This increase can be a part attributed to the increase in domestic production of primary aluminium, which is supported by the fall in domestic consumption. Finally, I would like to conclude this webinar with the views we have towards the import tariff hike. Even given all that we have discussed right now, and assuming that USA is able to meet its target of 80% capacity utilization rate, and with Canada and Mexico being exempted from the tariff hike, USA will still have to approximately import 1.3 million tons of aluminium, which is approximately accounting to 25% of their total demand. Further, countries that depend on the US for their exports, including China and India, would have to search for new markets to offload their aluminium products, which may result in an oversupply to other markets, thereby disrupting the demand supply dynamics. This may put some pressure on these metals prices in international markets outside of the US. Ever since the hike has been announced, the LME prices of aluminium have been falling. Now, given that the movement in international price of aluminium is primarily driven by the demand supply situations in China, the tariff hike could have a limited impact on the global movements, maybe in the short term, but in the near future, the long-term prices we assume will be stable. Now, ramping up of these production in USA may not be immediate and may entail various constraints such as establishing new supply chains, procurement of raw materials, raising adequate funding for operations, and modernization along with various costs associated with the manufacturing process to suit specific needs of these buyers. The US Department of Commerce estimates that it will take approximately 9 months to restart ideal capacity for aluminium. It will be important to notice how quickly USA is able to increase its domestic production to meet its domestic demand. We do not foresee a noteworthy increase in the domestic supply of USA in the next 1 year. India is unlikely to be adversely impacted by the tariff hikes given its limited share of exports of aluminium to the US. However, companies that have exposure to the US markets may see a decline in their top line and bottom line. Also going forward, other and newer markets would be increasingly preferred by Indian exporters. Lastly, India's trade surplus with USA will also continue even with the imposition of these tariffs on these metals. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvisha and Sanjay sir. Dear participants, now we'll be taking a break of 2 minutes before we come back to take your queries. You are please requested to start keying in a questions in the slot provided. I repeat, we'll be having a break of 2 minutes before we begin a Q&A session. Thank you. Hi friends, now we'll be starting with the Q&A session. I'll hand over the mic to Urvisha, who will take the queries.
So we have a question in terms of quantity of aluminium exports by Indian manufacturers to USA, it accounts for how much percentage of the US demand? Thank you for the question. So I would like we spoke about this in during the presentation. I would just like to go back to that slide so you can get an approximate figure. So up till now, we have accounting for only 2% of the aluminium exports to India and to the US. And this year it has been 96.3%. And initially it was 49.1 of the 1,000 tons of the share of exports. Another question we have is any key impact that you will see on the raw materials that are used to manufacture aluminium, such as CPC or bauxite. So bauxite is 90%, when India is exporting bauxite, 90% is to the Chinese markets. And right now the dilemma which we are facing is the bauxite is issued to an export duty. Now this is happening because a good quality of bauxite, which is supplemented to be used for the Indian manufacturing of aluminium, is getting exported. So we have given that because of that export duty, it is restricting on the aluminium exports. So because of the tariff impact, we don't see an impact immediately, because again it depends on China production and consumption, consumption and production. So with the tariff, there's no impact which we'll see on the bauxite. If there's a policy change in the Chinese policy, then we could see a difference in the bauxite export. But as of now, no. So we have a question that how is USA still subject to 25% of the imports? So approximately, as per the Department of Commerce of the USA, they are saying that they want to do 80% of the production capacity ramp up. Once 80% of that capacity is ramped up, they are thinking approximately and this is all again subject to uh, the assumption of the same level of imports and same level of exports and demand to be maintained. Since Canada is supplying 43% of the US demand, and that is exempt from the tariff hike. So, considering the same level of the Canadian exports, the same level of the increased level of US production, adding both of them up, USA still needs 1.3%, 1.3 million tons of aluminium. Now that has to be exported, and that exported aluminium will be subject to the tariff hike. So USA will have to come up with some bilateral agreement with the countries involved.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Viraj. Actually, you are asking for the presentation, which of course we can share it on your email ID. I think there are no more queries coming in, so probably we'll end this webinar with this. Thank you again to all the participants for taking the time out and being a part of this webinar. We hope the discussion was insightful, and we look forward to your suggestions, queries in the feedback box, which should be coming across by our email. Thank you for now.